I wanted to start there with a thanks to you and Judy for sponsoring the research trip that I went on. It's been almost a year now, last June. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to come and reflect on the research portion and what came out of that research. Because as I'm finding, writing up chapters and putting dissertation stuff together, I mean, you're lucky if you get a little paragraph out of a lot of the work that goes on. So when I spoke to Judy about setting this up, she said, I want to see pictures. And I thought, I do too. I want to see what this looked like. What does the research look like? So I'm going to try and concentrate as much on showing what the Center for the Study of Teaching and Writing was able to sponsor as I am going to concentrate on my own research and conclusions and all that kind of stuff, especially since I'm right in the middle of writing right now. So that's really where it's going to go. There are a couple things that I wanted to add about CSTW that I think are really important because you are an interdisciplinary body, right? You're not sponsored by the English department, correct? And I think that's really important because what I see as I do work on writing research is a disciplinary bias that shows up repeatedly wherever you go, and I'm always having to cross back and forth across that disciplinary bias just to get a lot of my research done. It's great that CSTW is an interdisciplinary body that's sponsoring writing research here on campus because it acknowledges that there's folks over in history and economics and education and all over the college who are doing work on writing. And I've been running across them in my work, and it just struck me as I got to reflect on what does this research look like. One of the things that it looks like is what CSTW looks like. It looks like an interdisciplinary body. All right, so starting out, here's Edinburgh, here's the Royal Society. This is actually a misnomer right now. I'm not sure that this is going to be, the project is going to be the Scottish Atlantic. I think a lot of the bias that we come to the study of literacy during the 18th century with is that the Scots were big leaders, right? And they were big leaders in the thinking about rhetoric and writing and the rhetoric of literacy and all the stuff that I'm interested in. But my focus today is really going to be on talking about how the three different sites that I'm investigating each give rise to their own local, sometimes divergent, sometimes convergent meanings for literacy and statements about literacy. I'm starting with a picture of the Royal Society because this is in Newtown in Edinburgh. It's the new building for the Royal Society, and it kind of represents to me an end point. This is sort of where the rhetoric of writing ended up in Scotland at the end of the 18th century, someplace really nice and fancy, but also very exclusive, right? And so I'm also constantly shuttling back and forth between these sort of exclusive, high-minded, and in some ways exclusionary ideas about how reading and writing are practiced, and the fact that literacy, reading, writing, print, books, newspapers, magazines, they're getting distributed all over the place at this time. They're becoming more and more recognizable as a valuable piece of cultural technology. Literacy is becoming more and more recognizable for that reason, and for that reason, it gets elevated. And one of the places I think that it gets elevated is in the Royal Society. Okay, so I'm going to do an overview today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the project principles, and I'm going to try to move somewhat quickly and somewhat informally through this part so that we can get to looking at some of the stuff that I did on the trip. But I want you to know that there's a couple of things that I'm working with here in thinking about transatlantic literacy discourses, and thinking about the rhetoric of literacy, and thinking about what writing meant, and what did it mean to show up and represent myself in writing. What does it mean in relationship to the history of print and the history of book culture? How does that change and shift during this time? So literacy is persuasive. If I can write in a way that looks like a book, right? If I can send a letter that represents sentiment or reason or character in some way, then I may be able to move myself forward rhetorically for whatever purpose that I have. And I was really interested in those purposes, as you'll see later in each of the different locations. I'm borrowing from John Duffy this idea of literacy being a generative rhetoric that I'm really interested in. Some of you may know John Duffy's work. Rhetorical because it's persuasive, generative because what's so interesting to me about this time in Atlantic history is that as I make these statements and represent myself and borrow the meaning of literacy for my own rhetorical purposes, those meanings get circulated and distributed throughout the Atlantic world through various networks and stuff, and other people pick them up, right? And it generates, aha, here's a place to sort of argue for myself from. Okay, quick example from Beth Manilescu's work on Henry Home, Lord Kames, which at least Louis is familiar with. Henry Home is a favorite figure from Edinburgh for me. He shows up in Edinburgh. He can't afford to go to the law school. He works as a copier. He works within this sort of old traditional mode of learning how to be a lawyer type guy by copying down Scottish statutes. His big innovation comes when he codifies that Scottish law. In fact, it's not codification, but it's really rewriting it for print. And he turns it into little narratives, and he turns it into little reasoned arguments, and he makes it accessible via indexing and via reasoning in a way that previously it had been accessible via rote copying. And so here's a tradition of literacy that Kames transforms in this new context, in the context of a new literacy technology, and this kind of launches his career. And he repeats this when he writes his famous Elements of Criticism. He does a similar thing with aesthetics and taste in literature, and we kind of cite him now as somebody who wrote one of the founding texts or the first texts of literary criticism. But what's interesting to me is how he went through this whole journey in transforming his own literacy practices and his own self-image via adopting the modes and affordances of print and the book. So he's an example, and this is something that Beth Manilescu's talked about a little bit more or less lately. So there you have it, being generative, distributive, and then of course Adam Smith is like, oh, Lord Kames, you're awesome, you're the father of us all, the founder of the Scottish Enlightenment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He really gets a lot of mileage out of not a lot of work, actually, I think. But a great example. So I'm looking for those rhetorical moments, those moments when things get transformed in that way, or invented in that way. And what I'm finding is that these inflections depend on location, they depend on the figure. I'm really interested in this idea of figures who came to represent the kinds of writing and literacy that were persuasive at this time. Kames is one of them. His status in Edinburgh society is why I count him as a rhetorical figure in his own right. Ben Franklin is another one. I just got to run through the exhibit really quickly. We're still talking about him and printing, and of course he gave up printing not long after this quote was written. Have you seen this? It's kind of silly. But anyways, these figures mean something, and their memorialization and the kind of monuments. This is the British Library. The monuments that we build to them do come to mean something. So what we have then is a kind of convergence in these networks of distribution that are circulating around the Atlantic, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. We have shared social and economic contexts that are really interesting, that give rise to a kind of convergence culture in terms of what writing meant across the Atlantic at this time. And then we have a shared sort of slow movement of literacy among wider social orders. But what's also interesting to me is the divergence and how different locations pick up and talk about the meaning of writing in different ways at different places. And also one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'll pick on English studies here, is that we tend to think of, and I'll include rhetoric and composition in that, we tend to think of all of this work of creating these meanings for writing and reading and justifying why more people should do them in these specific ways, like close reading or immersive reading or advanced composition using eloquence. All that kind of stuff sort of leads to English studies in some way. You run into that in some of the secondary literature, but then in other pieces of secondary literature you see it leading to the Enlightenment, or economic developments during the Enlightenment are leading to X, Y, or Z. So my focus lately has been really on, well, what's different and how can we tease out different threads, and is it fair to say in such an overlapping context that different locations have different literacy rhetorics? And so that's what I was looking for on this research trip, I said, let's go and let's see if there are different things that we can see. It's a little bit weird, like all scholarship, I guess, because I think in most of my locations, they're so international, they're so cosmopolitan, you can find all aspects of this convergence culture that arises. But I think you can also find important differences too. And that comes in part by reading the text, but also in part by examining the physical geographical locations and what's going on at those locations. You can look at Charles Withers on convergence culture in the Atlantic, really interesting. And then you can look at this long argument that McCusker makes about the quality of living in colonial America and the general movement of genteel manners down the social order across the Atlantic. Gregory Clark is an economic historian who argues that this results from the fact that the aristocracy have more children that live, and therefore their genes become the foundation of our modern Enlightenment industrial culture. Problematic kind of eugenic argument that Deirdre McCloskey, who I make a lot of work of, argues against. She says, I think there are other ways besides genetic and eugenic explanations for why this sort of genteel culture becomes more broad spread and more widespread at this period. And so that's, literacy is sort of where that comes in for me. Writing carries this genteel ideal, this genteel identity. Okay, so doing all that, what I end up setting up is a problem of multiple enlightenments. And we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but this is an argument that gets made in different places about, well, is there an American Enlightenment? Is there a Scottish Enlightenment? You know, what is the European Enlightenment? How is that different? All that kind of stuff. And here's my other plug for CSTW. When you go in as a writing researcher and not someone who is looking specifically for evidence of the Enlightenment, whatever one that it is you're investigating, you end up seeing a lot of different overlap, and you end up trying, or what I ended up doing is trying to push through some of the disciplinary boundaries that you find in this question of what is the Enlightenment. Enlightenment, 1750 to 1800, that's the period that I'm looking at. I'm also looking at it as a kind of precursor to the Industrial Revolution. So the period immediately following the Enlightenment is of interest to me, kind of in the background. Okay, this didn't come through, but can we see it better? So I've been playing around with visualizing what does this look like? What does the Enlightenment look like? And other people have been doing that too. You may have seen the Stanford project on the Republic of Letters that traces the movement of letters throughout the Enlightenment as defined by, their professor of French and Italian. And you see these, really recognizable and expected kind of connections between Edinburgh and Glasgow, London and Edinburgh, London and Paris and Geneva and places like that. And it's a great visualization, I think, but as you notice, we're filtering by the major figures of the canonical Enlightenment. If this is how we're defining what reading and writing meant, and this is, in fact, how a lot of people define the sort of Republic of Letters, the sort of group that trades in the meaning of advanced literacy at this time, you get a limited kind of image. It's not a lot of connection with the US or with North American colonies at the time, that kind of stuff. A different way of looking at this is to trace the kind of commercial networks that are circulating in the Atlantic at this time. This map is based on an image of what was called the Triangle Trade because it's fueled a lot by the trade in slaves to North America and the Caribbean, manufactured goods from England, and raw materials out of colonial North America. To me, what's so interesting about this image of writing and circulation of writing at this time is that it makes us look at commercial endeavors like the circulation of print. It makes us look at individual ties and also business ties in letter writing, all that kind of stuff. And it also makes us look at sort of the force of economic factors in spreading the ideas and ideals of literacy at this time. It's a little bit different than looking at the force of ideas, right? The force of the Enlightenment ideas and these, Hugh Blair, who comes up with a really great idea out of nowhere for what writing should mean, and all the American universities adopt it, but in fact, that's a pretty small picture of what was going on at the time in the Atlantic world. I could pause for a minute and just say here that the whole project gets haunted by the slave trade, which I really appreciate, and it's a challenge to get it integrated. But in Edinburgh and Scotland at the end of the 18th century, one of the big tests for their sort of new literate public sphere is the debate over slavery at the time. And then one of my figures, my rhetorical figures, who has a role to play in this dissertation is Olaudah Equiano, whose slave narrative includes a significant literacy narrative, and he moves from West Africa to North Carolina, then eventually to England. And along the way, he touches on literacy for purposes of work. He touches on devotional reading in the Bible, and he also gets a hold of a manual written by an Enlightenment thinker in the British Isles who has written a guide to converting the Indians. And so you see all different levels of different meanings of writing. And then by the time that Equiano arrives in London, he's there arguing that for his self, recognition of his own dignity as a person, literacy is one piece of evidence, right? One piece of the evidence. And so that's a way that literacy becomes rhetorically powerful. And it was really London where he had his, I think, best reception. So that gets us to our first site, which is actually the last one in the project, but London and the idea of dignity. There's the British Museum. That's founded in 1753 and opened to the public in 1759. And one of the big pieces there was King George's Library and the other founding libraries that were really the showcase for a couple of hundred years of the British Museum. It was one of the reasons why you would go there, is to get access to these really powerful libraries. But what happens when you put it in a museum and open it to the public, even though access wasn't so great for most of those couple hundred years to the books, is that you start to see this idea of literacy and reading and writing and the importance of books and knowledge and all that kind of stuff descend to and become more accessible to lower levels. And then you start to see other portions of society ascend and start to make arguments for their own selves. And this creates a lot of anxiety, and I'm really interested right now in London in this period because I want to see those figures where that anxiety gets played out. And there are books that you might be familiar with. A favorite example of mine is Pamela, where we have a printer write a handbook for young women that turns into a really famous novel, and it ends up starring a maid who can write, and that's a problem. Right? And then it also spawns lots of responses in the literary record at the time that talk about why she was dissembling, right? And part of the problem, I would argue, is that she's writing, that there is this wider scope for literacy. Another way into thinking about this question of dignity, Professor Graff cites E.P. Thompson on the idea of a moral economy. He calls it the moral economy of literacy and the literacy myth. And he starts saying that, well, in the absence of traditional social relations, a moral economy of literacy gets attached, right? It becomes part of our educational systems. It becomes part of our identity. Deirdre McCloskey pushes this even further, and she talks about a bourgeois revaluation, where every value gets rethought and rearticulated according to new bourgeois values that are about commerce, that require literacy, that include involvement from all members of the society in a capitalist system of commercial exchange, that kind of stuff. So I'm really interested in this question of dignity in London at the time. Also, it fits London because I'm not super familiar with London, but when I was there the last and before, there's a real, I think, if it's fair to say, conflict on what dignity means in that town. It's sometimes really dignified and sometimes not. So, case in point, Samuel Johnson, and I'm renaming him an itinerant compositionist because I think we don't really think of the fact that here's a guy who wanders into London and is trying to make his way teaching writing for a lot of his career. He's befriending actors and writing a dictionary that uses vernacular literature for the first time to dignify English, to kind of borrow I wouldn't say he's borrowing the quality from academic language, which was Latin. I would say he's really reinventing this idea of English as a vernacular, useful, and dignified language that can be used in a proper way. So this comes out in a lot of different ways that I'm working on right now. You know, his real life is interesting. Boswell's recreation of it is interesting. James Boswell, of course, from Edinburgh, where he did his education, and Lord Kames being the other person who he thought he would write an autobiography about. But the question is, and here I want to land a little bit, is like, well, how do you get through the huge mess of Johnson's scholarship? You know, when I went to London, I was really scared of Samuel Johnson. Just like I was really scared of Ben Franklin when I went to, I wasn't scared of Kames. But, you know, there's this massive industry around these guys. And so how do you sort of look for your theme? How do you say something? What do you see? Where do you begin to look? And indeed, a lot of my time in London, it wasn't as productive as Edinburgh because I was spending a lot of time just orienting myself to all of the resources of that city and just sort of sitting in the British Library and trying to figure it all out. And in fact, the British Library is where I had one of my sort of rabbit holes where I was looking at a literacy narrative by a Baptist suburban Londoner from this period, and we did a lot of work. His name is Joseph Mayette, and sort of just decided, wait a minute, I need a more representative type guy. Johnson is a more representative type guy, in part because we memorialized him. There's the attic where he wrote the dictionary. So I make my way to Johnson's house. Here's Hodge, his famous cat, memorialized out front. He fed Hodge an oyster, or fresh oysters every day, supposedly. Here's Francis Barber hanging in his house. And here's his Jamaican manservant who he leaves his entire estate to. And you have to sort of say, and the quote is, Johnson says, then I shall be nobilissimus. When he says that what he's going to leave to Barber. Barber moves back to Johnson's hometown with his wife and kids, opens up a drapery shop, inherits the books and all the stuff. And it's just a really interesting character, and it's interesting how we've memorialized him, and it's interesting what the story of Johnson dignifying his manservant might mean, right? So that's kind of what I discovered, sort of sorting through London and looking at the just great memorials to people like Johnson, to literacy, to reading and writing that you see there. There's King George's Library in the background that is now in the center of the British Library. So that's kind of what it looks like. Edinburgh, it looks a little bit different. For me, the story in Edinburgh is one of participation. And here, I'm not worried so much about dignification because in Edinburgh, I see a lot of I think it's been talked about a little bit in Scotland, this idea of dignity, and we tend to focus on the idea of Sheridan going to Edinburgh and teaching people, or did he go to going to Scotland and teaching people how to speak with a proper English accent, and that happened once. But what happened much more during the whole course of the century was this slow work of rebuilding Scottish society and bringing in literate middle managers who were educated thanks to the Scottish system in the church or in the universities or in the parish schools one way or another, and setting them up to really run the town after the Parliament moves down to London, after the king is already long gone. That kind of stuff. And so you have this idea of participation, and they're setting up there and they're doing all this Enlightenment stuff like having improvement clubs and social clubs and literary clubs, all this stuff. So I'd say emphasis on idea here because hierarchical notions of taste arise fairly quickly to regulate who and how and why participation in this middle class of middle managers, whatever you want to call it, in Edinburgh at the time. We get people like Kames and Blair both sort of drawing lines in the sand and saying, well, in fact, the educated man of taste will lead folks of lesser taste in this, and so let's invest in them. That leads us to institutions like the university. I'm really interested in how the university and the church provided literacy traditions that were adapted, distributed through networks of print and stuff like that. And that sort of was where my big find was. At the University of Edinburgh, here's the library help desk. They wouldn't let me take a pictures in the reading room, but the reading room was really awesome. It was on the top floor, and it had a sort of 360-degree view of Edinburgh and the surrounding countryside, so it was awesome to be up there. Did you ever look at this, Louis? This collection of student exercises? I was really surprised. So here's some of the research stuff. So I was really surprised to get there and have to pour through a manual catalog of university archives. I was like, well, isn't everything online? I've explored your website. You mean there's more? That kind of thing. The catalog itself was really helpful, and if we have time, stop me if this is getting too long, but the catalog itself was really helpful because it showed how closely the town and the university are linked, and how much work people were doing, university people were doing on building and rebuilding and promoting the town and all that kind of stuff. But the really cool thing was this bound collection of academical exercises, essays, by students from 1737 to 1750. Not your typical English professor assigning these essays, but they do have a lot in common with what Kames and Blair were writing about 20 or 30 years later. One of these essays I had seen referenced, I think, by Vincent Bevilacqua, and maybe by Beth Manaleska through there. Somebody had referenced one of these, and so I was chasing it down, and then I found that in fact there's like 25 of them, and they span this great period of time, and you get to see how themes like taste are being worked out in the university by students. And the big claim is that, you know, well, people like Hume and Lord Kames and Blair are teaching us about taste, where in fact we've already got this long tradition from the logic and metaphysics of the day that's doing the same thing, but it's not getting published and distributed, right? It's not getting codified according to the affordances of print or the book market. So I was really excited to read those. I haven't asked them to make a digital copy of it yet, partly because it's not going to look very good because they're bound pretty tight and I have a lot of notes. But I was really surprised. I was like, why isn't this online? Like, and I learned from the archivist, the head archivist, well, there's one other one, a book like this from this period in Oxford, I think, or Cambridge. And it was just sort of surprising to me, and this is, again, plug for CSTW. If I hadn't been a compositionist, if I hadn't been researching writing, I don't think I would have really paid a whole lot of attention to a book of student writing. Right? Today, people don't pay a whole lot of attention to what students are doing with their writing. So I was really gratified to find this, this volume and to start integrating it into my dissertation work, because it's a perfect image to me of how the existing educational institution is providing that tradition that can be transformed in the new, wider literate public sphere of print. Yeah.
Did you say there were 25 volumes?
No, essays. Yeah.
And so that suggests some selection. Is there any indication that are these meant to be examples? Good examples?
That's a great question.
Why is 25?
That's a great question. Half of them are in Latin, half of them are not by time or subject, just like every other one or every three, one would show up in Latin. There's no notation by the professor, but they do appear to be in student hands. So I haven't really figured out why or what the provenance of this volume is or how it ended up getting bound. I've read a little bit about the instructor, the professor, in one of the Victorian histories of the university, which was another thing that was useful to go there and have the archivist say, hey, this one from the 1890s is the history of the university that you want to look at, which I probably would not have gone to that one right away if I didn't have that kind of tip. So I still have to work on this collection and really figure out sort of what the significance of it is and where does it go and all that kind of stuff. Yeah?
How are you going to work on it since it's still there and you don't have a copy?
I've got my notes and I've got my email contacts and I've got my price. It's £35 to get for the essays that I want to look at, which is not all of them, but to get scans made. And so I have to decide at what point am I going to have scans made and really dig deeper into it. And because I think the notes are adequate right now for the dissertation work. So this is sort of a build thing for me. Okay, cool. All right, so Edinburgh, participation. Here's a picture. I do heart Edinburgh. It was a really it is a beautiful town, and it really struck me, and I was really surprised. I wanted to look at this picture, though, because I just wanted to look at how does the built environment then, how does being there differ from like actually just sort of, oh, I wish they would have scanned this and I could have searched it. Here's the dome of the university. This isn't built to the end of the 19th century. They're working on it, though, in my period, and they're talking about it. And it's capped with a little golden boy, which is sort of this image of that's famous in Scotland of the person who rises according to his merit, especially his educational and scholarly merit. So here's the university. Here's the castle. In my period, it's empty. The king's long gone. England, at the end of this period, starts housing prisoners there. But if you go to Edinburgh, you can't get away from this castle. And so it's really interesting to have English prisoners of war up there as a constant kind of reminder of the fact that you're not running anything here in Edinburgh. And to me, it's an interesting kind of way of thinking about, well, so what is it that they do try to run? And they do try to run a lot, and they do accomplish a lot as Enlightenment improvers at this time. Here's St. Giles Cathedral, right next to the old Parliament. I don't know what was going on in the Parliament buildings at that time, but that's where I stayed. That's where Hugh Blair had his position. And then there's I think the Tron Kirk, which is another big famous church up the road toward the castle. And so just looking at this image of the town, you have this history overlaid, and you have, of course, all these little figures walking around in here, participating in this history, talking to one another, and trying to make it work. All right. Surgeons Hall, I wanted to take a picture of because this becomes important. Edinburgh is important for its medical school. One of my guys from Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush, gets sponsored by Franklin, comes over, leaves a really nice journal of his time, talks about what it was like to graduate from the University of Edinburgh. The classical facade at the Surgeons Hall was interesting to me. Down the road, you have what becomes the new dome for the university. And then you have the Edinburgh Film Festival sort of right there, or one of the main venues for the Edinburgh Film Festival right there. So it was interesting to sort of be in and amongst, everything at the time. All right. So how are we doing? Do you want to hear more? Yeah. Okay. So that's old Edinburgh. One of the things they're working on in the university, and one of the things that people are working on at this time, is building new Edinburgh, the new town across the way. That's old stinky Edinburgh with the dirty castle and all the reminders of the bad stuff, and the church, which is, we don't really need that. Here's new town, beautiful, planned, laid out in really nice sort of avenues. This is where the Royal Society ends up. This is sort of the new exclusive part of town. This is a sort of movement of the capital that these people are generating into the built landscape and what their vision for that landscape is going to be. And it looks a lot more like sort of what I argue the late Edinburgh literacy discourse looks like, which is one of order, reason, rationality, but also exclusivity, and that kind of stuff. Okay, good. So that's my bridge to Philadelphia, which I'm just going to talk about briefly. And you can see that. That's good. So Philadelphia gets laid out by William Penn in an interesting way as well. But I don't know if it's too much to make a big point out of what this vision of Philadelphia, yes, ordered, yes, rational, yes, planned, how that differs from the one in Edinburgh, except that this city is put together and designed to be productive. This city is situated between the two rivers. It's laid out with lots of green space so people can grow their own food and do their agricultural activities within the city. There's lots to take advantage of. There's plenty of room to take advantage of in Philadelphia. We're not carving out a little bit of order from an old medieval jumbled mess. These are the themes that I see in a lot of the Philadelphia discourse that you might recognize as Franklin's interest in industry and thrift, right? And I think that right now in Franklin Scholarship, we're not looking at industry and thrift in the same way or in the right way. I'm not sure. I think that the way we talk about industry and thrift in Franklin right now, we sort of see it as him being humorless and being, let me say, well, I don't know what I'm going to say about that, but I'm still working on it. Franklin's ideals of industry and thrift do come forward, though, in the stuff that I'm looking at by him. And just over at the library, you know, I was really happy to see my favorite book that he ever printed, George Fisher's The Young Man's Best Companion, the American Best Companion, where he rewrites this literacy manual and sells it to an American audience. And he really talks about how literacy and industry can really create great things for the individual who purchases and believes in this little book. A lot of his stuff looks like that. A lot of the Poor Richard stuff looks like that. And I forgot to mention, in Edinburgh, I kind of have a guiding light. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, talks about the invention of modern social imaginaries of participation at this time. And he makes a lot about Adam Smith's work and stuff like that. McCloskey talks a lot about dignity in the period. For me, I'm interested in another economic historian when I'm thinking about Philadelphia, and that's Joe Mokyr. And he talks a lot about the Industrial Enlightenment. And he talks about the purpose of information technology in fueling the sort of transformation to the Industrial Revolution. And I think that Franklin is very interested in the same kind of aspects of information technology, including printing and the book and all that kind of stuff, but also the institutions that he built. Specifically, his Junto, his library company, and then what becomes the University of Pennsylvania, which starts out as a little charity school downtown in 1758. William Smith, Scott from Aberdeen, gets moved from New York, moved down from New York and becomes a champion of Franklin's English school, which is to say a vernacular education model, and or mechanics school, which is to say a model of practical education. So Franklin is really invested in this. He and Smith go head to head, and then the Board of Trustees, the folks in charge of the money, get a hold of the academy, the charity school. And one of Mokyr's points, one of McCusker's points, one of my points is that in Philadelphia, yes, we have this sort of rankle about no taxation without representation, but we're also making money hand over foot. And that capital gets reinvested in the city in lots of different ways. And one of the ways that it does is in the university and in the medical school. And everybody has a different idea about what that university and medical school is going to do. Benjamin Rush wants it to sort of save the insane for God's kingdom. Franklin wants it to be a kind of mechanic, practical place where people learn accounting and numeracy and declamation and letter writing in order to fuel their own private businesses. Smith is somewhere in the middle, but he has that European provenance where he's able to sort of bring in this ideal of classical education. So what's striking to me is the Surgeons Hall in Edinburgh and the Surgeons Hall here in Philadelphia. Philadelphia actually makes a lot of improvement over the sort of old, dirty classical facade that they had, but it's still the same kind of thing. You know, this is the high 18th century model of classicism, whereas the old Surgeons Hall in Edinburgh is a sort of, you know, basic copy of a classical facade. Okay. All right, good. Last slide. So I ran really quickly through that, but so where I have ended up in my research is this idea or this question of, do we want to foreground these different aspects of literacy rhetoric and sort of name them as important things that we should think about when we look at writing about writing in the 18th century? Do we want to foreground questions of participation, industry, and dignity and say those are some of our guiding lights when we're thinking about what's going on here, and we can see them arising from economic structures, traditions of literacy, built environments, geographies in ways that are a little more rich than simply tracing the circulation of great ideas. Because one of the things that's striking to me as I close my project is that, well, certainly I know lots of great ideas in the world of writing instruction, but I don't always see those getting implemented. That's a whole different thing. And I'm also interested in these sort of themes as questions to ask ourselves as writing instructors today. I mean, do we want to talk about participation and dignity? Do we want to embrace this question of industry or innovation? Do we want to recognize that as our means of distributing literacy rhetoric change, that perhaps some of these themes change? Maybe there are different things in our writing classroom today, in our multimodal classrooms today, that we would choose to foreground. So that is where I will end. Thank you for your patience. I ran really quickly through it.